Welcome to youTurn Radio. Here at youTurn Radio, we believe in big-hearted communities and small government. Join your hosts, NADIA RENNER, Tom Murphy, and Eric Steinman, as we work to put local governments on a diet and champion the charities that support your community. So come on, join us and let's turn it around.
Welcome to youTurn Radio. Happy Thursday. Beautiful day in the Inland Empire. We have a fantastic show today. If you're like me and you have a little time here in the Inland Empire, you're going to learn some stuff about the Inland Empire. So I'm really excited for today's show. Also, last week's show, we want to thank Downtown Fates and Time to Taco, which we were talking about local businesses and if local government is helping local businesses. You can find all of those episodes on youturnradio.com. But like I said, today we have a really good show. We're going to learn a little bit about history, right, Tom?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about today's show. Radio issues here.
I think your mic is off, so they can't really hear Tom. But I'm sure that Tom is as excited as I am because Tom is kind of a history fan, if I'm not mistaken, right, Tom?
You know, I am. I'm not a history buff.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, I think a history buff is somebody that really has a grasp of kind of the overall view of history or something like that. And that's good. What I am, though, is I'm really interested in stories. And our guest today, Mr. Joe Blackstock, tells great stories in his column. Welcome to the show, Mr. Blackstock. We really appreciate it. And we'll make it easy and call you Joe.
Absolutely. I don't answer to anything else.
So today we're having a conversation with Joe, a retired journalist, but he's really not retired because he writes a weekly column about the history of the Inland Empire, right? And just before we keep going and we get into our topic today, we want to make sure that we let you know that here at youTurn Radio, we believe in local government and big-hearted communities. Therefore, if you call in 909-792-5222, that's 909-792-5222, you call in, we get to spin for charity, and what that means is that we spin the wheel, and whatever amount it lands on, we donate that money to a local charity here in the Inland Empire.
Yeah, which the cool thing is that we got word that last week maybe some people tried to call in, but they couldn't get through for some reason. I guess there was technical difficulties, but I think it's working today. So make that call if you want to win some money for your favorite local charity.
Absolutely, and we've given away thousands of dollars. You could win from $100 to $1,000 or more. So make sure you call in 909-792-5222. All right, so let's jump in. So today's title is Those That Forgot History. Why is that, Tom?
There's an old saying. It was actually, I think, originally coined by a Spanish philosopher author, and he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And that kind of got shortened to "Those that forget history are doomed to repeat it." And our guest today appears to have a really interesting approach to telling little vignettes about the history of the Inland Empire. If you read his column, he just comes up with stuff that probably everybody has forgotten, but he digs it out from a source or something like that and tells just a really interesting story.
For sure. So before we get started, let me ask you, Mr. Joe, real quick. How did you start getting into writing topics about the Inland Empire? Because, I mean, I feel like when you're a journalist, you are open to write about almost anything.
Well, as a reporter, I've retired 3 years ago from being an editor, and then before that, a reporter. And about 20 years ago, when I was working for the Inland Valley Daily Bulletin, which is in Ontario, I went to the editor because I've always loved history, and I said I'd like to write a twice-a-month column about local history. And one interesting thing, I told one of my colleagues at the time about it, and she says, well, there's no history out here. I mean, they just, the Spanish came and they put up a bunch of orange trees, and suburbia came, and that was the end of it. There's no real history here. So 20 years later and 700 plus topics later, I feel pretty good that I'm still finding new and better things to write about. So that's sort of the way it is. I've always loved history. My dad was when we lived in Alhambra, he was on the Historical Society and all that. So we always did, if there was a plaque to stop at or a historic building, we would always stop and take a look at it. He didn't force it down our throats. He just said, "Here, there's something interesting to look at." So that's my viewpoint. I like the little history, not the big history. I don't want to write about the people that everybody knows about. I want to write about the people that nobody has ever heard of.
And he's got some great, some recent titles from some of his columns. One is "Gamblers Skip Town after laughing at San Bernardino's low bail," and then he has another "Altaloma landlord found Hell's Angels difficult to evict." And then he has a fascinating story about a gentleman that fought in World War I and was killed. Except he wasn't really killed. We'll let Joe tell the story. It was actually fake news, if you will, from the government.
Hashtag fake news.
Yeah, his name was Roy Swans. He was an African American, and so when the United States went into the First World War, he was one of the very first to enlist. Well, that posed a problem for the military. The military didn't want African Americans in units with non-African Americans. So in essence, they had throughout the war they had segregated units, and in some cases, some of these the African American units were assigned to the French because the Americans, literally didn't want them mingling or fighting with white units. It makes no sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea is to, kill the enemy, and they're still worried about a race. But anyhow, so he came, but his father, who was a janitor in the city hall here in San Bernardino, got a letter from his daughter saying that Roy had been a deserter. He had gone during the war. He had left his unit, and he was been captured, and he may be shot as a deserter. Oh, wow. Well, what's very strange about this is the father took that letter and gave it to the San Bernardino Sun, which printed it. I'm not sure that's the thing I would have done.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so that's how we know about this. So then there's not another word about this anywhere. Again, this is 100 years ago. And finally, a letter comes from Roy to his father saying, I'm in Virginia. I'm in a hospital. I'd been shot. And I'll be home very soon. And his father, of course, sent that letter to the Sun and said, hey, my boy is still alive. Well, there was another letter came up, and it came from a former soldier that he worked with Roy, or fought with Roy. And the soldier was telling Roy, whom he thought was home at that point, that thank you for saving my life, that he had gone out into no man's land, that area between the lines, where bombs were coming and bullets and poison gas. And apparently Roy had crawled out there, got a hold of him and dragged him back and saved his life. So Roy, who at one point was thought of as a deserter, his parents or his father thought, oh my gosh, he might even be dead, turned out to be a hero. And eventually he came home. He had 2 machine gun bullets in his side, got that repaired, and was very active in veterans events here in the San Bernardino area. And he's buried at the Veterans Cemetery at Sawtell near Westwood. But it was a strange story. And I still can't figure out how word could come that he was a deserter when he was apparently functioning, it's one of those things with the past, which you're dealing with, that sometimes you can't answer those questions. Those questions are not answerable. The father's dead, Roy's dead. Perhaps everybody who knows every detail about this is not around to answer. So sometimes I don't even write those things if they're so open-ended. But this was so strange, so odd, and I was able to piece together enough stuff to actually write a story which I think was fair to what was going on. Why they thought he was a deserter, I have no idea. I wish I could answer. I'd really like to know, but...
The thing that I really liked about that story, or where I really put myself in that story, was in the father's shoes. I mean, here you are, and you think that your son's a deserter, and particularly in that time in Epic, that would not have played well. And then to find out, hey, my son's actually alive, and hey, he's not a deserter, he's actually a hero. Just the emotion in that would be really...
Oh, absolutely. I also find it interesting that, for example, nowadays, with my generation, we put everything on social media.
Absolutely.
So that's how people find out, of news or things that are happening within our families or things like that. But his dad sent it to the Sun, which is the local newspaper here. That's interesting to me. I wonder what his thought process, and to send that letter to the news or to the
That
newspaper.
would have been the last thing
Right.
I would have sent to the newspaper, but I just don't know. There's a lot of unknowns. I hate stories like this that I can't track down these holes that are in it. But and again, sometimes you run into a story like this and you can't do it. I'm trying to be faithful to the past and accurate. And if there's too many holes in a story, you just have to put it aside, because no matter what, people are going to get the wrong impression. So.
Right. We saw on your Twitter bio that it says that you are retired after 47 years in journalism, and we want to know a little bit about your career. So what motivated you to become a journalist? I know you shared a little bit about, your father being involved also in showing you guys historical places, moments, and that kind of happened.
My father wanted to be a journalist. He was at Pasadena City College, and as a sports writer for the local the school paper, he got to know Jackie Robinson, who was a star at Pasadena City College. So that was kind of fun. But this was the end of the Depression, and so he got a job with an outdoor advertising company and worked there for 50 years doing public relations and marketing and doing things like that. And he never got it, but he always loved to write things. And when the chance to work on the school paper at my high school, I said, okay, so I did that for 2 years. Then I went to junior college and did that for 2 years, and then got a real job, or a part-time job, and was gainfully employed for the next 47 years. So I think I don't think you can really be a journalist if you don't like people. You want to find out about people. That has nothing to do with dealing with government and all that sort of stuff. But there's a fascinating situation where I pester people. I meet somebody and then find out a little bit about them, and I start asking questions, and then I have to excuse myself for saying, I'm sorry, I forgot that I'm not interviewing anybody. I'm just interested in you. I'm interested in people's background. So that's what I did. There's a certain amount of excitement. There's a great deal of boredom, or not boredom, but tedious work that has to be done. And but I don't ever remember not wanting to do it, not being interested in going to work every day. And I think that really says something about a job, or jobs, the various jobs that I worked in.
Right. What's that saying? It's not work if you love what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I have to go to work because I want to make sure for my family that I get my paycheck. But the bottom line of it is that I would do things. I don't think I ever took an overtime hour for about the first 30 years I ever worked. I just never put it down. If I had to work extra, well, that was part of the job.
Right.
So, however illegal that is, but it's a reality.
Go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, did you spend? You said you spent 47 years working. Was that all at the Daily Bulletin, or was that
no. I worked in
different?
newspapers in Monterey Park, in West Covina, Pasadena, Riverside, and then at the Daily Bulletin for the last 18 years.
Oh, okay.
So in some cases I was an editor, in some cases I was just a reporter or a sports writer.
Which of those, pay aside, which of those would you prefer doing? Would it be the reporting or the editing?
Oh yeah, and quite honestly, if I had a choice, I would just interview people. The writing is somewhat of I realize that sounds weird, but I would prefer to be out talking to people and watching things and doing things. Maybe I should have gotten into television, therefore I didn't have to do anything after I reported. But sitting down and writing, I mean, that's part of, that's what you got to do. But that's all right. That's spreading the word, spreading the enjoyment of what I've seen to other people. So.
Working in these different cities, what has been one of the highlights or stories that you've covered that you're like, man, that was a good one?
Actually, writing this column for the last 20 years has been the most fun. I'm not sure whether they mean that, but that's the most enjoyable. I've just had so much fun chasing down the stories, the history of this whole area, and telling people about it. The best compliment you could ever say to me is, I didn't know that. Okay, Joe, geez, where did you get that story? How did you do that? Well, then I think I've brought back some lost piece of history.
What's kind of your process for developing or discovering some of the pieces?
Oh well, now that's the fundamental question that everybody asks, and I can't answer. Well, I think I have always been looking for a story, whether I was a reporter. My eyes, no matter where I am, if I'm in a movie theater, if I'm buying bread at the store, walking down the street, I'm looking for stories. It's kind of strange, but that's my way of doing it. It's the same thing for this. Every time I'm looking for, say I'm looking for Mr. Roy's information. Well, while I did that, I run across something else. I go through a lot of the microfilm or the digital copies of the local newspapers. There's all of the Suns, all the way back before the turn of the century, are on that. Not so those in the west end of the county are mostly on microfilm. But I've ruined my eyes for 20 years on microfilm reading. But invariably, when I go and do something and look for something else will catch my mind. And I'll make a little copy of that. I'll stick it in a drawer, and that's where I found out about Roy Swan's. The headline was something like, local boy believed to be a deserter, shot, or something. That was the headline. Well, you just can't let that go by.
Right.
So you make a copy, put it aside, and then you work on some stuff. And then while you're doing some more process, you run into something else. My process is I'm always looking for stuff. And I have a pretty good eye. I can look through a whole page of something, a digital or something like that. And for some reason, maybe the good Lord is helping me out here. My eye will go to a word or two, and I'll go, my gosh, look at that. Many years ago, I was looking at one of the Pomona papers. It was on Lincoln's birthday, and there was a 2-paragraph story, and it said, our local hero will be happy to know that it's Lincoln's birthday," or something dumb like that. And I thought, who's this local hero? Well, the guy's name is George Foster Robinson. One of 150 years ago was an extremely well-known person, and nobody knows who he is now.
Okay.
When Lincoln was assassinated, they also tried to assassinate Secretary of State Seward. It was part of a big conspiracy. Well, the guy who tried to kill Seward was stopped by an injured aide named George Foster Robinson of Maine, and he pulled the guy off and saved the Secretary of State. This is the guy who bought Alaska for the United States afterward and things like that. Well, he ultimately came to Pomona and lived in Pomona for the last 15 years of his life.
Okay. Wow.
But you will not find a school, a street, nothing named for George Foster Robinson, who was given the Congressional Gold Medal. I mean, he went from he was a sergeant, they made him a colonel, and he became in charge of the military pay distribution after the Civil War for the next 20 years. So he became very wealthy, came to Pomona, bought a orange orchard, and he lived there. Well, this is a guy I find out about him from a 2-inch story that I wasn't looking for him at all. So when you're dealing with history, it's all a bunch of luck. And I'd like to tell you that I'm brilliant in terms of this, and I know everything, and it's just a matter of snapping your fingers and you're there. But no, you just blunder into a phenomenal amount of things. And I hate to admit that, but that's the truth.
So it becomes a development, obviously, and you spend, sometimes I'm assuming that you spend a lot of time on certain stories more than others. When you start developing these stories and you really get into these stories, out of all the stuff that you've written, has one impacted you personally or emotionally?
The one that I am most proud about, I wrote 17 years ago. And most people are somewhat aware of the fact that the United States imprisoned anyone of Japanese ancestry, even citizens, during the Second World War in internment camps. Tens of thousands of people, even those who were born here, were in prison. Well, what I didn't realize, I'd lived out here for a while, that in Pomona, the fairgrounds, the LA County Fairgrounds, in prison, they assembled them there for 4 months, and they built houses, and there were guards and all that sort of thing. I didn't know anything about this, and it was pretty obvious nobody else did, or very little. That took quite a long time to do. I found my dad knew a man who had been there, so I interviewed a couple of people. It came out really good. I hate to be, that sounds like my ego talking, but I was very pleased with it. Well, I got a lot of great responses from that, and finally, they just 2 years ago, they put a big plaque in front of the LA County Fair building commemorating that, because the Japanese Americans didn't want that memory to be lost. That people knew that American citizens were incarcerated for simply being Japanese.
Wow.
I'd say out of all the ones I've written, that's one I just felt good about, that I think it was having some small amount of conclusion from that people learned about. Again, it's one of those, gosh, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And so now it's a lot more commonly known. It wasn't that it was a secret. It was just, well, it was, to be honest with you, something most people didn't want to talk about.
Right.
Yeah. It was embarrassment.
Yeah. My 95-year-old mom she was right near the end of high school, the beginning of World War II, and had a good friend that was Japanese ancestry, and she was just gone one day, and she said, we didn't really know what to think, didn't really think about it, but that's an interesting story, because very likely my mom's friend was in that spot.
Oh, yeah.
Out in Pomona.
Well, if you
That's
can imagine forcing all these people, they were given 3 days to dispose of their property. If they owned a house, they had to sell it to somebody. Well, you can imagine a lot of shifty people bought their houses for 10 cents on the dollar, things like that. Or they had to, if they didn't have Anglo friends who could watch their stuff, and they were gone for sometimes 4 years. And then the most ironic thing of all, of course, the military coming around about halfway through this period of time and recruiting military-age guys to come out and fight for their country that imprisoned their families. Right. So, I like that. I really liked the story. I was able to put together enough, a lot of stuff, and hopefully it educated a few people. Those people who didn't want to know about it, they don't care.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into our break, we'll do another story before we break. How did a mafia leader get support from San Bernardino officials?
Well, the city of San Bernardino has been very nice. I don't live in San Bernardino, so I can talk about that. But, there was a guy who lived out. I live in Upland, and out in Upland, there was a gentleman named Joseph C Dippolito, who was he owned some orchards, but he was also listed as one of the top mafia leaders in all of Southern California. And so one day he had been arrested for something, I don't remember what, and convicted. Then he wanted to own a small supermarket, a small liquor store on 4th Street in Ontario. But he couldn't get a liquor license because he was a felon. Okay, so lo and behold, it was his brother-in-law or somebody had this thing. Well, there was some investigation, and sure enough, it was showed that he was running the place. So he was arrested for that and convicted. Well, but they hadn't been sentenced. Well, within 2 days of his conviction, before his sentencing, the mayor of San Bernardino, the police chief of San Bernardino, and a Superior Court judge in San Bernardino all wrote letters to the judge who was going to sentence him, saying what a great guy he was, that he had really helped in the community and all this sort of stuff, even though there was a book. This was later, but it was well known. He was listed as a mafia leader involved in sort of things. There was a book that came out called The Last Mafioso. And there's several pages about him and how one of the ranches he had somewhere in Rancho Cucamonga, which I was never able to find out where, that was a burying spot for bodies that they had to get rid of. They would take a body, cover it with salt, with something.
Your column said lime.
Lime. Well, thank you for at least paying more attention than I had. Covering with lime, putting it in the ground, and so under some houses there in Rancho Cucamonga, I suspect. Maybe sometime. Hopefully they don't dig too deep. But that was the odd circumstances by the city officials who just thought he was a terrific guy.
That's insane. I mean, imagine like they started building I don't know what, and then all these bodies.
And the bad news is the newspaper found out about it, and that's when everything got a little. The judge said, "Oh, I made a mistake. I'm sorry, I was wrong." The other two guys just kind of went, shrugged their shoulders.
I don't know.
It's not for me to make conclusions that I can't base on facts, but
they're all gone. But he's a known mafioso, and these guys.
This was, I believe, about 1969. This happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
That really sounds like a movie. One of those, like The Godfather. Yeah. Like that would be right under one of those.
And
movies.
this guy was. I mean, didn't I think in the book you mentioned they relate a couple pretty brutal murders.
Oh no, he was involved. Well, again, the information in these kind of books based on people who are ratting on other. The only way that information comes out is somebody who's a bad guy telling about another bad guy. So it's hard to know. But the book details a lot of stuff. The Last Mafioso is very interesting. I hadn't been aware of that, but the market that he was headed is still there.
No way!
I don't know who owns it, but I'm afraid to ask.
I wonder if they know the history of it.
I believe they do. I talked with after I wrote the column, somebody called and said that they had read in the book about this and had gone in and, well, as you might expect, the guy running the market is going to say, "Oh no, I don't know anything about it. We're involved," and probably they don't. But I don't know.
It's
a great story. I was just fascinated when I ran into this, and where I got the story was reading an article in the Sun that said the police chief wrote this letter about this mafia guy saying what a terrific guy he was. And that's the kind of stuff you don't put that away. You say, "Whoa!"
Why is he writing this letter? What's going on here?
Well, he knew that he had a tough background, but that while he was living in Upland, but he had lived for a long time in San Bernardino. And during that time, he'd been a terrific guy, and he donated money to charities and all that sort of stuff, and that they had never really found any. Well, I would imagine a mafia guy is not doing little robberies and car thefts, so it wasn't anything that the police department in San Bernardino had to deal with.
Okay.
So, who knows?
That's so interesting. We're going to go into a commercial break. We're going to come back with more here on youTurn Radio with Mr. Joe Blackstock and talking about the history in the Inland Empire.
And just tell these stories and have a lot of fun. So, are we soon?
And we are back on air. We're having so much. We're having a good time out here. You're listening to youTurn Radio, and if you are just joining us, we are here with our guest Joe Blackstock. We're talking about the history of the Inland Empire, and we went over some of the stories that Mr. Joe has covered, and there's so much history in the Inland Empire. And I think, for me, I didn't grow up here, but this is really interesting stuff. Stuff that you probably won't hear about in a book or online. I think this is like really, really good stuff. So it takes good journalism to do, and you've done it for so long.
Maybe lucky journalism.
Lucky.
I blunder into it sometimes.
I love it. So we were talking about different stories. Before the show, we talked about a mafioso here in the Inland Empire. So we're going to switch it around a little bit. There's an article that you wrote, How Women Saved Inland Empire Agriculture 100 Years Ago.
This was, it's called the Women's Land Army. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know anything about this until I, again, blundered into this someplace seeing a story. When all the men had left the area to fight in World War I, there was we had thousands of acres of trees and crops that had to be dealt with, picked and weeded and all that sort of stuff, and there was some limitations on bringing people from Mexico or other countries. So they created something that had been started in England called the Women Land Army, and women, mostly college women in college, were encouraged during the summer to come out and do that. And here we had in the area of Etiwanda, which is part of Rancho Cucamonga now, there was about 100 women, mostly from UCLA, who were housed at a elementary school on Archibald Avenue, and they worked in the orange packing houses, picking or weeding, picking crops, working hard, and in many cases saved farmers who not only would have lost money, but these people were producing things that the military, the food,
Right.
that the civilians and the military needed. So I mean, this was a vital situation. But it was called the Women's Land Army, and basically in the United States, or at least out here, it existed it was most active in 1918. Of course, the war ended at the end of 1918, but they were also somewhat active again in 1919. And they did it a little bit in the Second World War, but it was not. There were hundreds and hundreds of women out working in the fields throughout the Riverside and San Bernardino County. So that was kind of a fun story that I'd never heard anything about.
I love listening to these type of stories. It's like girl power.
Absolutely. Oh well, and you know, it's interesting you should mention that, because I've written over 700 columns, and it bugs me. Mm-hmm. That I haven't written more about women, and part of it is that history has ignored women, especially I'd say prior to the 1960s. There's just not very much. The only time women are on the front page is if there's a crime or they divorce somebody.
Right, with a lot of money.
Well,
Like
or
Amazon
something like
story.
that. Yes, but I mean, it just isn't. So it's very. So anytime I can find something involving women, that I really jump on that any way I can, because I feel I've shortchanged them. I may have a reason for having shortchanged them, but nonetheless, it bothers me, and I'm continuously looking for.
He's got a column that's titled, and I'm sure I'll butcher the title, but it's basically local leadership, city councils, that type of thing, after 50, 60 years are all still man caves.
Well, the women in California got the right to vote in 1911. This was before most of the rest of the country, 1911, not 1920. Since 1911 up until the 1950s, no woman in this area had been elected to a city council. Wow. Not one.
Wow.
Now, here in Redlands, there was a woman who was appointed, but she didn't run for re-election. So in the 1950s, there were only 3 women on any city councils that had been elected, and it wasn't until the 60s and 70s that women started doing this. Now, I will tell you, not very many women were running. Mm. So, I mean, you could say, well, why weren't they elected? Well, they weren't running. But and even now, if you take all the, I looked at all the city councils between San Dimas and to Yucaipa, 17 cities. Mm-hmm. 3 of them have no women on them. Only 2 of them have a majority of women. And basically, if you collectively look at all of them, only about 26% of the members of our local city councils are women. Now, again, not many run, but the fact of the matter is that kind of bothered me. I was stunned when I found that out, and I found a mayor of Fontana in about 1950 someplace, where they had come to him and said, we want you to appoint so-and-so to a vacancy on the city council. And he basically said, oh, well, women can't handle this job. It's too tough for them. They're not fast enough. They don't understand what we're doing. And so there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was it. When I see a quote like that, boy, I just jump on that one. That's a great quote. But that was their feeling a lot of cases. So I'm looking for women to take the ball here, like they have nationally.
Yeah, I think it's happening, and we see it more this year. And I also think it's interesting because the mayor of Fontana right now is it's a woman, and she's an African American woman too. So
and 2 of the members of the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors, which has a majority of women on it, 2 of them are former Fontana city council women. Mm. So ironically, 60, 70 years ago, this guy was off his gourd a little bit, but now not only are there members on the Fontana City Council, but the council is producing leaders in larger positions. So it's kind of fun. But when I saw that quote, that's just gold. I would have paid money for that quote to be able to use that.
Yeah, it's so ironic too that I live in Fontana, where all the powerful women are coming from.
Well, that's it. But until the 1960s, no woman had been on the city council, and the lady who got rejected was the first one to be elected. She ran 2 years later, and said, "I'm going to do this," and she ended up being getting on the city council, and then she got the job, which is full of drudgery and boredom. That's not a job I would ever want.
Right. Too easy. So let's move on to Ontario's first airline, because there's so many people that fly out of Ontario day in and day out.
Well, this is one of my favorites. If you go into Terminal 4 of the Ontario Airport, you'll see a giant mosaic mural. And it's got a picture of Archie Mitchell, who was one of the leaders of Ontario to found the airport, and Waldo Waterman, and he has wearing a hat with goggles up there, and it says was Waldo Waterman. Well, Waldo Waterman was a kind of a fly by the seat of your pants pilot, and in 1924 he thought he would use his aircraft to fly people to Big Bear Lake. And you say, well, what's the big deal there? Well, getting there by car in 1924 was very difficult. All dirt roads, all that. So I'll just fly him up there. It won't take very long. So one day in 1924, he had the mayor of Ontario and a couple of other people. The mayor of San Bernardino. I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind here. The mayor of San Bernardino got in his plane and flew up to a little tiny airport in Big Bear Lake, and they dropped him off, and they spent the night there. In fact, Waterman actually flew back. I guess he had something to do. So the next morning he got up, flew back there, picked them up to take them home. Well, Big Bear Lake the air in Big Bear is a lot thinner than it is down here.
Right. And
you have a full load with a full load of gas, and he took off and he landed in Big Bear Lake. And the mayor almost drowned. He broke his arm, but one of the people in the plane did drown.
Wow, okay.
And they dragged everybody out and stuff like that. And so that was the inaugural flight of the first airline out of Ontario Airport. Wasn't very successful. He flew back and forth, probably was a lighter aircraft or something, or less people for a while, but it never did make much money. But that's why Waldo Waterman's mug is up there on this mural on the terminal for the Southwest Terminal.
That is so great, because I mean, I've been through Ontario Airport a few times, and I didn't have any idea.
Yeah.
Well, you look for that mural. I mean, it's like 15 feet wide, 10 feet high. It's a huge mural there in the Southwest Terminal.
Right. Is there any relation between, you said, Waterman and Waterman Drive?
I do not believe so, because that was Governor Waterman, who lived here for a while.
Okay.
And I, to be perfectly honest with you, that's my guess, but that would seem reasonable. This was a guy who was governor for about 3 years.
Okay. All right.
I can't even remember when, so I'm pretty sure that was the case, but it could be.
Yeah, it's likely the governor.
Yeah,
not the guy who crashed on the.
I hate it when people ask me questions I can't answer. But,
well, I didn't even know there was a governor named Waterman.
Well, it was a guy who lived here. He found a mine up in the mountains and out in the desert, made a bunch of money.
Okay.
And then he became a lieutenant governor. Why, I don't really remember, but he was the lieutenant governor, which even today means that you're not doing anything for 4 years. Well, then, except the governor died. So he got pushed into being the governor. That'll teach you to try to get an easy job. So I think that was around 1890, quite a long time ago.
Well, in your opinion, what is the worst story of government corruption you ever ran into?
Well, it probably was in my little hometown of Upland, where we've had some violation. The mayor. Let me see. I can't try to remember where we are. About 8 years ago, the mayor was arrested for taking bribes, and things like that. He ended up spending 3 years in jail. Followed shortly thereafter by the city manager violating a whole bunch of laws and eventually being thrown out of office and that sort of stuff. I've run into little minor things and stuff like that, but that was a particularly odd situation for why this was a guy who had a construction firm. So when you have situations like that in a small town, there's a lot of conflicts of interest, and sometimes it turns into bribery. So.
I think I remember hearing about this. Basically, hey, if you use my consulting company, you'll get through the planning process.
And it was really dumb because he had somebody, I can't remember who it was, go pick up the money from somebody. Or he went over and picked the money up or something. It was so, it felt like it was Chicago in the 1915 or something. It's like, how can you be so dumb to do something like that? I mean, it's bad enough that you did it,
right.
But geez, couldn't you have done it with a little more finesse or something? But bad people usually do a lot of stupid things, unfortunately.
No, I believe you're correct.
We've learned that here. You wrote a column last October titled "Always Seeking Answers Even Through Bathroom Doors." Tell us.
Well, that takes us back to beautiful downtown San Bernardino again.
Okay.
It was a column I was writing about newspapers and what newspaper writers, reporters were doing for you, meaning you, the public. And there was a lot of things going on here. This is 1915 something, I think, and a lot of gambling, a lot of booze, a lot of they were actually selling alcohol on Sunday. Oh my gosh, but that was against the law. So the San Bernardino Sun was really ripping, particularly the police department, for letting all this stuff go. And finally, they wanted an answer from the police chief. Well, one of the reporters one day was walking down the street, saw the police chief, and there he is. So we started chasing him, and the guy ran for a couple blocks, and then slammed the door in a bathroom. And
this is to get away from the reporter.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
It sounds like a fake story almost.
Yeah,
like.
and then the reporter started pounding on the door, screaming at him, saying, "Why won't you answer our questions about blah 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 and this and that and the other thing?" And he was screaming from inside the door, "I don't know," "I don't have any proof of what you're saying," even though everybody knew about it. And the paper also that next day said, "Well, if the police chief didn't know, why don't you ask Councilman so-and-so? Because last night he was in the back of so-and-so's store drinking wine on a Sunday afternoon when you can't do that," or something like that. But so that was just something that was a little tidbit in the bottom of a story that sometimes they just jump out at me.
Right.
I'm so thankful. I would like to think it was a brilliant skill and brains on my part, but in reality it's just darn luck.
Well, that's so funny because when you tell that story, it's almost like here I try to get interviews with supervisors and people that work for the county, and I've had little, but I mean very little luck. And this story, it's like I can only see myself running behind them like, "Get me an interview."
Well, the average reporter, and really, if you look at, I don't know whether you've ever seen the show Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And in it, there is a song about the governor of Texas saying, "I love to do a little sidestep." And he would go, the reporters would ask him questions, and he would talk for 5 minutes, realizing he's not saying anything at all, and then he would say, "Okay, thank you," and he'd leave, and all the reporters would say, "What did he say? I don't understand." So that's I'm afraid, unfortunately, that there's a lot of that in government from top to bottom, right, these days, where you ask a question and you're not getting an answer.
Absolutely. We're going to ask you the last question before we have to leave. But what do you believe is the most important role of a journalism as a profession?
Well, it is to be to think that you actually have some role in making government behave. That sounds silly, but what I mean is, it's important for government people to know that you're out there watching them, and that you will raise an issue, you will pound on a bathroom door, whatever it takes to get the answer. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's important for them to know what's out there.
All right. Mr. Joe Blackstock, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I think there needs to be more shows like this because you shared so much good information with us, especially for somebody like myself that has come to the Inland Empire and lived here. I feel like I learned so much, especially the women stuff, the women's story. That was great. That's all for us here at YouTurn Radio. For more YouTurn, make sure you go to youturnradio.com, and we'll be back next Thursday, same time, 3 p.m. See you next